The information presented in this podcast is general. It is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. It should be never used to diagnose, prescribe medical or psychological conditions, or replace a physician. And it is not intended to prevent, treat, or cure such conditions or substitute for mental care, preventive health care, counseling, or therapy from or a physical or mental health professional. Thank you for listening and blessings. Have you ever wished to discover how to help your employees with their occupational stress in a mindful approach? What if there is a way to building a productive and supportive environment for your employees that leads you to influence the organizational culture positively? Well, this is your invitation to join us to Mindful Leader Talk, a podcast on the effects of mindfulness as a secular practice on occupational stress and organizational culture. Welcome to the Mindful Leader Podcast, Mindfully Coping with Occupational Stress. I am Maria Baez, an organizational leadership psychologist, consultant, coach, and a full-time magician. In today's podcast, we have an special guest, Keith Tully. He is the CEO of Power Times Consulting Group, a business and life coach, and a Point graduate and a former Army officer with a ton of experience in leadership, entrepreneurship, and coaching. He is an author and a podcaster and sits on the board of several nonprofit organizations. Welcome, Keith. I'm so glad to have you here.
Hey, Maria, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
Of course. In the Environment podcast, we learn about the different sectors of our lives and how they interrelate. There is a belief that mindfulness is seen as an application only to the personal reality. However, we spend most of our time at work and we can't update one environment and not affect others. This is why we would like to know more about why do leaders practice mindfulness at work and why is this essential?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I love the idea that more and more people are coming together to try to talk about this topic because it's really important. And I don't know how many leaders have over the year kind of tried to figure out the special sauce that is necessary to make people stay at work, because a lot of people they don't leave jobs because the job is hard, right? They leave the job because their leaders are stressing them out. And the one thing that you can do at a business is to build that culture that can sustain the mindset of true leadership, which is, in my estimation, is leaders of character, right? Character being defined as following a set of morals, not necessarily like religious morals, but like a set of values that the whole organization actually believes in, right? That they
Right.
believe in together. And one of those is to have develop a culture of leaders who are sort of like coaching leaders, the leaders who will help the folks under them, and in many cases, help them cope with stress, and recognize when they as leaders are doling out extra stress, maybe because they're stressed or maybe because there's a deadline, whatever it is, they have to put things in their interactions with their folks that will de-escalate the anxiety, and one of those things is practicing some mindfulness exercises, and whether that comes in the form of controlling your breathing or taking a moment or just talking with someone, you know um, it's just vitally important in this environment, and especially in the last 2.5, 3 years with COVID.
Yes,
um,
of course.
there's there's been extra stress, and we can see it everywhere,
Everywhere.
it's affecting everyone. And to ask someone, "Hey, are you okay?" A lot of people will just glance over that question. Yeah, yeah, I'm good. Let's go. They don't want to
Right.
bog you down as a leader or as a boss, and it's incumbent on the leaders to turn around and say, no, 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 really, I'm asking, how are you, and get a real answer. So that's why I think mindfulness has been cropping up more and more over the years, because leaders really need it, and they need to be competent and promote it, and also because the last 3 years have been highly, highly stressful for a lot of
Right.
us.
It's like coming from everywhere.
Sure, yeah.
What are the critical challenges that leaders may face in today's work environment when practicing mindfulness?
Yeah. So taking the environment again into consideration, there's a lot of unemployment, a lot of underemployment, and a lot of folks who are working from home. And if you look at that and the stress that that causes, I would tell you that I've seen a lot of people just having to cope. And so if you're looking what the environment has given us, I think it has become more and more, increasingly important to practice mindfulness. And again, what does that look like? Those are the three like environmental issues, I would say. And then, you know, internally, I would say it's mostly about culture. Because if you're in a company that does quarterly reviews, or a lot of them just do annual reviews, and they just kind of don't figure out what's happening. They don't do on the spot corrections. They don't say what's happening now and deal with it now. They kind of like try to save up their comments and and whatever they're doing, whatever they're going to say for their reviews, And in many cases, I think that's the wrong answer. And unfortunately, a tremendous amount of companies do it because it's hard to take them in many cases to have difficult conversations with people when you're trying to do something right at the moment it happens. So let's give an example. If you're in a meeting and someone says something that you didn't, that you found inappropriate, and that's, in the back of your mind, that causes you a little bit of stress, and it could be causing everyone around you a little bit of stress, and you have to deal with it. Now you can stop right there and say, nope, we don't, we don't say that kind of stuff around here, right? If it's part of your culture, you can do that. But a lot of people, a lot of companies, they don't have that immediate response. They don't have, and they can't point to a bunch of values that they listed on the wall or on their website to say, this is what we do, this is what we don't do, right? So that challenge, that singular challenge of building a culture that does that, it can resolve a bunch of other challenges, right? So if you can stop at the meeting and say, nope, we don't say things like that. We don't say things like that here. And everyone knows that, you can just move on with your meeting, right? Because everybody's on board. They're like, yeah, that was inappropriate. That guy goes, sorry, everybody. I didn't mean it that way. Whatever. The meeting continues, and doesn't matter, right? You move on. And that can be something that you discuss in private with that person later on or whatever. But at that moment, you can continue with the meeting and everyone knows what just happened, and it's part of your culture to do so. So if you can resolve to take those values and keep them um, in your company, and you can move together, together, all of you know what's acceptable, what's not acceptable as far as values are concerned, and you all live those values, you resolve a whole lot of other problems. So another kind of that I think is important is, when I was in the military, one thing we always did was we would praise in public and we would criticize in private, right? Because it was one of those things, don't get me wrong, there were plenty of leaders who criticized in public, made an example of people, and that kind of thing. So it's not a perfect system. But for the most part, the rule was you praise in public and you criticize in private. So if someone at the same meeting that we were just talking about said something inappropriate or said something that didn't make sense or was just rude and talking over people and blah, 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 what we would do is say, we would table whatever they were saying for the moment and say, hey, that's enough, right? We'd tell them, that's enough from you right now. And then later we'd go talk to them. Like, what were you thinking? Or as an example, I was a very young second lieutenant, and some guy asked me to do an award ceremony for him. right? To pin on his next rank. And I thought it was going to be pretty easy, and I didn't think I needed to prepare too much for it. And I walked in and I said a couple of jokes about the guy, sort of like joking that he was not a great soldier, and meanwhile he was the complete opposite, right? But
Yes.
I was joking that he wasn't a great soldier and that we didn't really need him. And then I said no, 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 like, and I brought it back and said, no, we couldn't do anything without this guy, right? But then I didn't say much more because it wasn't like an award ceremony as much as a promotion ceremony. So I didn't
Right.
think I needed to go like into a bunch of things that he did, but I was wrong. My operations officer was there. Everyone clapped. Everybody, nobody seemed offended or anything like that. But the operations officer, who was a major, he's 4 ranks above me, he pulls me aside and says, you really ought to have said more about his value to the organization rather than like say it in a sarcastic sort of way that he was good. The jokes were fine. What you did was all right, but what you really should do in situations like this is pound on the praise, right? Give him a little extra stuff. Tell people what he is and who he is and what he's done and that kind of thing, because then not all these people know him as well as you do, and not all these people, you know what I mean?
Yes, they can take it wrongly.
So while I was doing it, they just clapped and went along with it, but because it really wasn't about me, it was about him. But at the end of it, the guy brought me aside and said, this is how to correct yourself, right, in the future if you're ever asked to do this again. So long story short, I learned my lesson and moved on, and I've had plenty of promotion ceremonies and all that, but it was part of our culture at that moment to bring the person aside and say, you really could have done that better, and I think that's important. I think it's important to have very critical conversations at critical moments so that people learn. Because if you wait to the end of the year or you wait to the end of the quarter, I mean, how many people remember what they had for dinner last night, right?
Right.
How many
Yes.
people how many people remember exactly the words they said or exactly the actions they did to get to a certain point over a 3-month time period or 12-month time period? It's not great. So as a leader, if you can learn to break down those moments as they happen, criticize in private, but break it down as it happens, and make that part of your culture as well. That's going to change the dynamic of what you do, and I think that handles a lot of problems.
Right. And that goes in alignment with to live in the present.
Yeah, absolutely.
What are your recommendations for overcoming daily stressful events or situations, challenges at work?
Oh my goodness. So there's so much, but I think the first thing to do is to start off your day or your work day with a few minutes of mindfulness, right? A few minutes of figuring out what it is that, how you're feeling, and then what's going on personally and professionally, and then kind of figure out your game plan for the day. Because so I take about 10 minutes every morning, just as an example,
Right.
to talk to pray, because I'm a Catholic and I pray, but that's not, you don't have to be religious to do this, right? You can um I like to sit and think of like at least 5 or 6 things that I'm thankful for in that moment. And I like to uh, kind of just figure out like where I sit in my own emotions, like how do I feel today? Right? Am I,
Yes.
even if it's just I feel sick, and run down, that at least that exists, and you're not guessing as you go through your day, like what's going on with me. So I think that there's just a lot of goodness in just spending 10 minutes in the morning or 10 minutes before your workday starts to just kind of think about what you're doing, be mindful of what's going on with your body, be mindful of what's going on around you, and maybe check your calendar and say, hey, these are things that cause me stress during the day. Normally I have a meeting, I have this, and then run the priorities and that kind of thing. Because if you do that, you can say, hey, well, I got to get my kid after school, so I have to be done at this time to make sure that I don't have to stress and go, create road rage for myself and all these other kind of things, right? So you can kind of balance that stuff out, and you know where your deadlines are, you know what to expect, and you can manage yourself. I find that it's really tough to be angry when you're being grateful.
Yes, they're opposite.
Right. So if you come up with 5 or 6 things, even 3 things that you're grateful for in the morning, and you drive to work and you're going over those things in your head, and then you show up at work, it's really difficult to just fall out of that grateful mindset
Yes.
and start barking orders at people, right? Unless that's your personality, and and you just, that's what you do, you bark orders at people, but it's harder to be upset when you're grateful. It's harder to be anxious when you're grateful. There's a lot of benefit to just finding that sweet spot, and you just deal with things differently. Like if you come to work and you're worried that you're going to be bad, you're prepared for something or whatever. If that's the primary thing that's on your mind, then probably you're going to have a self-fulfilling prophecy and you're going to be bad. So if able to kind of just take a moment, maybe prepare a little more for the meeting, right? Because that is a valid point, but also think about how the meeting might go, and like the things that you have to say and the things that people might ask you, and you'll feel more prepared, and even go over it with a buddy, right? There are ways to cope. So if this is part of your again, going back, if this is part of your culture, right, when you're about to have a meeting, 30 minutes prior, you and the people who are going to be in that meeting kind of sit together and go over some things, then there's no surprises, and you feel more prepared as you walk in the door, and nobody in that room, on your side anyway, is going to really be surprised by anything you say, because you've just done it. You've gone over it real quick. So there are all kinds of little steps that you can take. That doesn't take much to go into to spend 15-20 minutes before a meeting going over some things you have to say. You have to talk about things you're even worried about, get them off your chest to your people, and then have that conversation, and then no big surprises in the meeting, rather than walk into the meeting and
Yes.
no one's on the same page all of a sudden for some reason. So these are little things that can change your whole day. They can change your whole mindset. They can change the way people interact with each other, and keep all the negative down to a minimum and boost the positive.
Correct.
Yeah.
If anyone would like to be in contact with you, whether it's for your consulting services,
Yep.
coaching, how they can reach you?
Simplest way is to go to Powertize US, POWERTIES US, and there's a bunch of information there. I've got my podcast information there. I've got my book information there. Everything you could use. So it's pretty easy.
Beautiful, beautiful, lovely. Well, Keith, thank you so very much for this opportunity to know more about your mindfulness practices at work. And I hope that you have a beautiful day and
You.
keep being mindful.
Yep. And thank you again for having me on. I'm sorry. I feel like I talk too much, but it was definitely wonderful to be on your podcast, and I look forward to seeing you again.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Take care.
If you have any questions, concerns, or comment, please visit my website www.mbaezconsulting.com or send me an email to maria@mbaezconsulting.com. This is the Mindful Leader Talk, a podcast on the effects of mindfulness as a secular practice on occupational stress and organizational culture. Feel free to invite, to listen, or share this podcast. Stay in tune for all coming episodes to building profitable organizations driven by the well-being of their employees and therefore our society. In the meantime, please stay safe. Blessings!